Sarah Chen had built her empire on secrets. For 12 years, she'd been Manhattan's most sought-after private investigator, the woman who found what others couldn't, who uncovered truths people paid six figures to keep buried. Her client list read like a Forbes 500 directory: hedge fund managers hiding offshore accounts, celebrities concealing affairs, politicians burying scandals before they could breathe. She wasn't just good at her job, she was legendary. But on September 3rd, 2024, exactly 3 weeks after she helped a client destroy evidence in what would become the largest corporate fraud case in New York history, Sarah would learn that some secrets refused to stay buried, and the woman who'd spent over a decade exposing others was about to have her own life dissected in ways that would make everything she'd uncovered look like child's play. If you're fascinated by how the pursuit of truth can become its own kind of lie, and how the person who sees everything can be the blindest of all, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story will show you that sometimes the investigator becomes the investigated. But let's go back to where Sarah's carefully constructed reality began to crack. Sarah had grown up in Chinatown, the daughter of immigrants who'd arrived from Taiwan with $300 and a dream that felt more like desperation. Her father, David Chen, ran a small electronics repair shop that barely covered rent. Her mother, Linda, worked as a seamstress in a factory where speaking English wasn't required and asking questions wasn't encouraged. They wanted their daughter to be a doctor, a lawyer, someone respectable who wore clean clothes and didn't come home smelling like soldering iron and fabric dye. Sarah had different plans. She discovered her gift at 15 when she proved her best friend's boyfriend was cheating by tracking his credit card purchases, following his MetroCard patterns, and documenting his movements with the kind of obsessive detail that should have felt creepy, but instead felt like power. She wasn't just finding information. She was solving puzzles that other people were too lazy or too scared to complete. Columbia University on scholarship, degree in criminology, 2 years with the NYPD before she realized that working within the system meant accepting its limitations. Private investigation meant freedom, meant choosing her clients, meant making the kind of money her parents couldn't imagine. By 30, she was clearing $500,000 annually. By 35, she owned a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights and drove a Tesla her father still didn't believe she could afford legally. Her reputation was built on 3 principles: absolute discretion, undeniable results, and a moral flexibility that made her valuable to people who couldn't afford traditional ethics. She didn't ask if what she was doing was right. She asked if it was legal, and sometimes she didn't even ask that. The Meridian Capital case seemed routine when it landed on her desk in July 2024. Thomas Blackwood, CEO of a private equity firm managing $8 billion in assets, needed someone to verify his CFO wasn't embezzling funds. Standard corporate investigation, the kind Sarah had done dozens of times. She accepted the $150,000 retainer without hesitation. What she found was so much worse than embezzlement. James Martinez, the CFO, wasn't stealing money. He was documenting how Blackwood had been systematically defrauding investors for 6 years, moving money through shell companies, falsifying returns, paying old investors with new investor money. It was a Ponzi scheme sophisticated enough that the SEC hadn't caught it, massive enough that its collapse would destroy thousands of retirement accounts. Sarah should have walked away. She should have reported what she found. Instead, she did what Blackwood paid her do. She found Martinez's leverage and neutralized it. The CFO had a gambling problem, debts to people who didn't accept payment plans, a secret that made him vulnerable. Sarah documented everything, built a case that would destroy Martinez if he went public, then presented it to Blackwood with the kind of cold efficiency that had made her career. "He won't talk," she told Blackwood in his corner office overlooking Central Park. "And if he does, this will bury him before anyone believes a word." Blackwood transferred another $200,000 to her account that afternoon. She deposited it without guilt, without hesitation, without understanding that she'd just become an accessory to fraud that would eventually implicate over 3,000 investors. Martinez stayed quiet. Sarah moved on to her next case. The system continued operating exactly as it was designed to. protecting people rich enough to pay for protection. But karma, Sarah would learn, doesn't care about your bank balance. The first sign of trouble came August 12th. Sarah received an encrypted email from an anonymous sender with a subject line that made her hands go cold. "I know what you did for Blackwood." The message contained no threats, no demands, just a simple statement. "You help hide a fraud that will destroy lives. There are consequences for that." Wait. She traced the email through every backdoor and proxy she knew. Whoever sent it understood digital forensics as well as she did. They'd used VPNs layered through 6 countries, cryptocurrency mixers, burner devices that pinged off cell towers for 30 seconds before going dark. This wasn't an amateur. This was someone who knew how investigators think because they thought the same way. Sarah increased her security. Cameras on every entrance to her brownstone. Encryption on all devices, a Glock 19 in her nightstand that she'd owned for years but never thought she'd actually need. She told herself it was paranoia, that anonymous emails were the cost of doing business in her industry. She was wrong. August 20th, another email. This one included a photo of Sarah leaving Blackwood's office the day she delivered Martinez's file. The timestamp, the location, even the weather matched perfectly. The sender had been watching her for weeks. "You're very good at finding secrets," the message read. "Let's see how you handle having your own exposed. The game starts now." Sarah had investigated stalkers before, knew the patterns, the escalation, the psychology. This felt different. There was no emotion in these messages, no rage or obsession, just cold calculation, like someone conducting an experiment to see how she'd react. She hired her own investigator, Marcus Webb, a former FBI agent who specialized in cybercrime. If someone was targeting her, she'd find them first. That's what she did. She found people. But on August 28th, everything accelerated. The SEC announced an investigation into Meridian Capital. Whistleblower testimony, they said. Evidence of systematic fraud. Thomas Blackwood was arrested at his estate in the Hamptons. Perp walked past cameras in handcuffs and a bathrobe because they'd raided at dawn. The news showed his wife crying, his teenage daughters hiding their faces, his empire collapsing in real time on every financial network. Sarah watched from her office, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, fear. Not of getting caught. She'd been careful, had documentation showing she was hired for a routine investigation, had never directly participated in the fraud itself. But fear of whoever was orchestrating this, whoever had known the investigation was coming and had warned her it would. The third email arrived that night. Blackwood's arrest is just the beginning. You helped him hide evidence that would have stopped this years ago. How many people lost their retirement because you were good at your job? How many lives did you destroy for $350,000? You're about to find out exactly what that feels like. Sarah's phone rang at 2 a.m. Marcus Webb, his voice tight with something between anger and fear. "We need to talk. Now, not over phone." They met at a 24-hour diner in Queens, the kind of place where no one cares who you are or why you're having coffee at 3 a.m. Marcus slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of Sarah, hundreds of them, leaving her apartment, meeting clients, shopping for groceries, sitting in her parked car, checking her phone. Weeks of surveillance documented with the precision of a professional operation. "Whoever's targeting you has resources," Marcus said. "This isn't some angry client or jilted lover. This is organized, funded, and they're playing a long game." Sarah flipped through the photos, her investigator's mind cataloging details. Different cameras, different angles, different times of day. At least 3 people working in shifts. Equipment that cost tens of thousands. "They want to know they're watching," she said. "If they wanted me dead, I'd be dead. This is psychological. Or it's preparation," Marcus countered. "Maybe they're documenting your patterns before they make a move." Sarah went home that night knowing sleep was impossible. She sat in her living room, lights off, watching the street through her window. At 4:37 a.m., she saw it. A sedan parked 3 blocks away, engine running, someone in the driver's seat. She grabbed her keys and her gun, moving with the kind of reckless determination that comes from fear turning into anger. By the time she reached the street, the sedan was gone. But on her doorstep, she found an envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Sarah, age 16, in a police interrogation room. She remembered that day with perfect clarity. Her first real case, the one that had made her realize she was good at this. A classmate's sister had gone missing. Police had no leads. Sarah had found her in 3 days by tracking the girl's boyfriend's cell phone records she'd accessed illegally using social engineering and a fake badge she'd made in her school's print lab. The girl was found alive. The boyfriend went to prison for kidnapping. Sarah became a legend in her school. The police never questioned how a teenager had obtained restricted phone records. They were too grateful for the solve. But someone had kept this photo. Someone had documentation of Sarah's first illegal investigation, evidence that her entire career was built on a foundation of broken laws and moral compromises. The message attached was simple. You've been breaking rules since you were 16. Time to pay the bill. September 3rd started like any other Monday. Sarah had 3 client meetings scheduled, 2 surveillance operations to review, 1 background check to finalize. Normal. Routine. The kind of day that made her forget someone was systematically dismantling her life. The first meeting was with Catherine Rodriguez, a corporate attorney who needed help proving her law partner was stealing clients. Standard work. They met at a coffee shop in Midtown, discussed strategy, agreed on fees. Catherine left after 30 minutes. Sarah stayed to finish her espresso and check emails. That's when the police arrived. For detectives, badges out, movements coordinated like they'd done this 1,000 times. Sarah Chen, the lead detective, asked, already knowing the answer. We need you to come with us. You're under investigation for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and illegal wiretapping. Sarah's legal mind kicked in immediately. I'm invoking my right to remain silent. I want my attorney present for any questioning. But even as she said it, she knew this was different. This wasn't about Blackwood. This was about everything. They took her to the precinct, processed her like she'd processed hundreds of people during her NYPD years. Fingerprints, photos, property inventory. They confiscated her phone, her laptop, her car keys. Then they led her to an interrogation room she recognized from her own past. Detective Marcus Sullivan led the questioning. He was maybe 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen enough lies to spot them from across a room. You're a smart woman, Ms. Chen. You know how this works. We have evidence linking you to multiple crimes over the past 12 years. Illegal surveillance, evidence tampering, blackmail, conspiracy. We have testimony from 17 former clients detailing how you helped them bury information, destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses. Sarah sat silently, her mind racing through possibilities. 17 clients. That meant someone had convinced 17 people to break attorney-client privilege, to confess their own crimes to implicate her. That level of cooperation didn't happen organically. Someone had orchestrated this, offered immunity or leverage or both. We also have this, Sullivan continued, sliding a folder across the table. Inside was her complete case file on Blackwood. Every email, every document, every piece of evidence she'd gathered on Martinez's gambling debts. But more than that, there were annotations in red ink, notes showing exactly how her investigation had helped Blackwood continue his fraud, calculations of how much money investors had lost because she'd silenced the whistleblower. You didn't just work for criminals, Sullivan said. You enabled them. You're not an investigator. You're an accomplice. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Sarah said nothing, invoked her rights repeatedly, waited for her attorney. But in the silence, she was doing her own investigation, analyzing what she was seeing. The evidence was too complete, too organized. Someone had been building this case for months, maybe years. Someone who understood not just what she'd done, but how to prove it in ways that would survive legal challenges. When her attorney finally arrived, Daniel Park, a defense lawyer she'd worked with dozens of times, his face told her everything. It's bad, Sarah. They have recordings, emails, testimonies. The DA is talking about 20 years. Who's behind this? She asked. It's not just the police. Someone fed them everything. Daniel hesitated. There's a name that keeps coming up. James Martinez, Blackwood's CFO, the one you dug up dirt on. The pieces started clicking together. Martinez hadn't just stayed quiet. He'd been preparing, building his own case, documenting everything Sarah had done to silence him. When the SEC investigation started, he'd gone to prosecutors with a deal, testimony against Blackwood in exchange for immunity, but also a second deal. Evidence against Sarah Chen in exchange for protecting his family from the gambling debts she'd exposed. Martinez had turned the tables. The person she'd investigated had investigated her right back, and he'd been better at it. The bail hearing was a media circus. News outlets that had praised her investigative work now labeled her a rogue PI and criminal enabler. Her parents sat in the gallery, her father's face unreadable, her mother crying silently. The DA argued she was a flight risk with international connections and resources. Daniel countered that she cooperated fully and had deep community ties. Judge Anderson set bail at $500,000. Sarah posted it using her brownstone as collateral, the home she'd bought to prove to her parents she'd made something of herself. Released on ankle monitor, she returned to a business that was collapsing. Client conseil de contract. Her website was flooded with reviews calling her a criminal. Former colleagues who'd referred cases to her now claimed they'd always suspected she crossed ethical lines. Sarah Chen, who'd built her reputation on being the best, was now infamous for being the worst. The investigation expanded daily. Federal prosecutors joined the case, adding charges of wire fraud and RICO violations. They were building a narrative that Sarah hadn't just helped individual clients. She'd run a criminal enterprise, a business model based on helping wealthy people evade justice. The trial date was set for December. Sarah had 3 months to prepare a defense for a career built on indefensible choices. Her attorney laid out the options. Plea deal, testify against former clients, cooperate with ongoing investigations, serve 5 to 7 years. Trial, risk 20 years if convicted, maybe walk free if they could create reasonable doubt. The problem was reasonable doubt required believing Sarah didn't know what she was doing was wrong, and her entire career was evidence of someone who knew exactly what line she was crossing. Sarah chose trial, not because she thought she'd win, but because the anonymous sender, the person who'd orchestrated this entire collapse, had made one mistake. They'd threatened her. They'd warned her the game was starting. That meant they had something to lose, some vulnerability they were trying to protect by destroying her first. For 3 months, while preparing for trial, Sarah ran a parallel investigation. She used every off-the-books contact, every favor she'd accumulated, every investigative technique she'd perfected. Someone had targeted her specifically, had invested months and significant resources to bring her down. That kind of obsession wasn't about justice. It was personal. The break came in November. Marcus Webb, still working her case despite the risk to his own reputation, found a pattern in the anonymous emails. The encryption was sophisticated, but the timing was specific. Every message had been sent between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Eastern Time. Analysis of the routing showed they originated from servers in the same 3-block radius of Lower Manhattan. Cross-referencing that location with people connected to her past cases, one name emerged: Rachel Martinez. James Martinez's wife. A former software engineer who'd quit her job at Google 5 years ago, officially to raise their kids, but who'd actually been struggling with depression after her husband's gambling addiction destroyed their savings. Sarah had documented all of this, had used Rachel's medical records and therapy sessions as leverage against James. She'd invaded every corner of their lives to build her case. Rachel hadn't just been a victim of her husband's addiction. She'd been a victim of Sarah's investigation. The realization hit like physical pain. Rachel Martinez, a woman Sarah had treated as collateral damage, had spent months learning everything Sarah knew about surveillance, investigation, digital forensics. She'd used her engineering background and her rage to become what Sarah was, someone who found secrets and weaponized them. The difference was Rachel believed she was pursuing justice. Sarah had only ever pursued payment. The trial began December 2nd, 2024. The prosecution's case was devastating because it was true. They showed how Sarah had helped a domestic abuser hide assets from his wife during divorce proceedings. How she destroyed evidence linking a pharmaceutical executive to safety violations that later resulted in 3 deaths. How she blackmailed a journalist to kill a story about political corruption. 17 cases, 17 times Sarah had chosen money over morality. Her former clients testified, their immunity deals protecting them while they burned her. Thomas Blackwood himself took the stand, describing how Sarah had helped him silence James Martinez, knowing that the fraud would continue, that more people would lose everything. She was the smartest investigator I'd ever met, Blackwood said. That's exactly what made her so dangerous. She knew what I was doing was wrong. She helped me do it anyway. Daniel's defense strategy was simple. Sarah had operated in a legal gray area, yes, but she'd never directly participated in crimes. She'd gathered information. What clients did with that information wasn't her responsibility. It was weak, and everyone knew it. Then Daniel called Sarah to testify. Against his advice, against every strategic consideration, Sarah insisted on taking the stand. She'd spent her career finding truth. Now she'd tell her own. Everything the prosecution said is accurate, she began, and she could feel Daniel's panic from across the courtroom. I helped people hide crimes. I destroyed evidence. I intimidated witnesses. I didn't do it because I was evil. I did it because I was good at it, and people paid me extremely well, and I convinced myself that everyone was doing it, so why shouldn't I? The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. You're saying you knew what you were doing was wrong. I knew it violated ethical guidelines. I told myself those guidelines were arbitrary, that my clients deserved aggressive representation, that the system was rigged anyway, so I was just evening the playing field. You knew James Martinez was trying to expose fraud that was harming thousands of people. Yes. And you silenced him anyway? Sarah met the prosecutor's eyes. Yes, because Thomas Blackwood paid me $350,000, and I valued that money more than I valued those victims I'd never meet. You're admitting to all of this. Why? Sarah looked at the jury. Because someone spent months destroying my life to teach me a lesson about consequences. They succeeded. I understand now what I couldn't see before. Every case I took, every line I crossed, I told myself it was just business. But business doesn't make it less evil. Being good at something doesn't make it right. The jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, the verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty on 12 counts of obstruction of justice. Guilty on 8 counts of conspiracy. Guilty on 23 counts of illegal wiretapping. Not guilty on the RICO charges. The jury had found middle ground between complete condemnation and acknowledging she'd operated in a system that rewarded exactly what she'd done. Sentencing came in January 2025. Victims gave impact statements that lasted 4 hours. A woman whose abusive ex-husband had used Sarah's evidence to gain custody of their children. A man whose brother died from a drug that should have been recalled if Sarah hadn't helped bury the safety report. James Martinez himself, describing how Sarah's investigation had pushed his wife into a breakdown that required psychiatric hospitalization. You didn't just invade our privacy, Martinez said. You weaponized our pain. You turned my wife's suffering into leverage. She spent a year in therapy learning to function again after what you exposed. Rachel Martinez wasn't in the courtroom. Sarah had tried to reach her, to apologize, to acknowledge what she'd done. Every message went unanswered. Judge Anderson sentenced Sarah to 12 years in federal prison. With good behavior, she'd serve 8. At 37, she'd be 45 when released, her career destroyed, her reputation permanently stained, her empire reduced to nothing. You were gifted with extraordinary intelligence, Judge Anderson said. You chose to use it to help the powerful escape consequences. The irony that you now face your own consequences is not lost on this court. May you spend your time incarcerated developing the moral compass you should have had all along. Federal Correctional Institution, Danbury, Connecticut. Sarah Chen, inmate 84729, spent her first year in silence. Other inmates whispered about the PI who'd helped rich criminals, some with admiration, others with contempt. She kept her head down, worked in the prison library, taught other inmates basic computer skills. Her parents visited monthly, the drive from New York a ritual of parental love that transcended shame. "We're still proud of you," her father said during one visit, words that broke something in Sarah that money never had. "For what?" "I destroyed everything." "For finally telling the truth." Better late than never. The first letter from Rachel Martinez arrived 18 months into Sarah's sentence. It was short, handwritten, furious. "I hope every day in there feels like how you made me feel when you exposed my private therapy sessions to strangers. I hope you understand what it's like to have no privacy, no dignity, no control over your own story." Sarah wrote back immediately. "You're right about everything. I turned your suffering into a weapon. I treated your life like a puzzle I needed to solve, not like a human being who deserved respect. I'm sorry doesn't cover it, but I'm completely sorry." The correspondence continued, sporadic and painful. Rachel's letters were therapy sessions in reverse, making Sarah experience the invasion she'd committed. Slowly, impossibly, they evolved from rage to something like understanding. "I destroyed your life to make you feel what you made me feel," Rachel wrote in year 3. "I thought it would make me feel better. It didn't. It just made me someone I don't recognize." Maybe we're both learning the same lesson too late. The realization that they'd both become monsters to fight each other was the kind of irony Sarah would have appreciated before prison taught her that irony is just tragedy you haven't processed yet. She used her investigation skills differently now. She helped inmates file appeals, found documentation errors that had resulted in wrongful convictions, taught classes on digital privacy to women who'd never had it. "It's the first time I've used what I know to actually help people," she told the prison counselor during a mandatory evaluation. "Before, I was just good at finding information. Now I'm trying to be good at something that matters." The Meridian capital fraud case resulted in over $4 billion in restitution to victims. Thomas Blackwood was sentenced to 25 years. James Martinez's testimony earned him immunity and witness protection for his family. The house of cards Sarah had helped maintain collapsed exactly as Martinez had warned it would, destroying retirement accounts, college funds, lives. Every victim's story was a reminder of what Sarah's $350,000 had cost. In year 5, Sarah's first parole hearing arrived. She sat before the board without hope or expectation, just truth. "I don't deserve parole. I helped criminals avoid justice because I was good at it and it paid well. I told myself everyone was doing it. That was a lie. Not everyone sacrificed their morality for money. Just me." The board denied parole. She'd serve at least 3 more years. Sarah returned to her cell, to her students, to the legal work that had become her atonement. She'd spent her youth building an empire. She'd spend her middle age understanding why it deserved to fall. Her mother visited the next week. "You're different now," Linda said through the glass. "You finally look like my daughter again. I destroyed everything you sacrificed for." "No, baby. You built something that deserved to be destroyed. Now you're building something that deserves to survive. That's what I taught you. How to work hard. I never taught you to work hard at the wrong things. That lesson you had to learn alone." Sarah Chen will be eligible for parole again in 2028. She'll be 41, having spent over 8 years behind bars for a career built on helping people escape exactly what she couldn't. Whether she deserves freedom is a question the system will answer. Whether she's earned redemption is something only her victims can decide. But in the meantime, she investigates. She learns. She helps women who remind her of who she once was: brilliant, ambitious, convinced that intelligence is the same as wisdom. "I was the best investigator in New York," she tells her students, "and I used that gift to make the world worse." Don't confuse being good at something with doing something good. They're not the same thing, and learning that difference cost me everything. The case of Sarah Chen remains controversial in investigative circles. The brilliant PI who crossed every line. The woman who weaponized privacy. The investigator who thought being smart meant being right. There are no heroes in this story. Only people learning too late that talent without morality is just sophisticated destruction. Sarah Chen is alive, but the woman she was died when Rachel Martinez decided that justice mattered more than mercy. What remains is someone trying to answer an impossible question. How do you atone for helping evil thrive? How do you build a life worth living after spending years making other lives worse? Sarah doesn't have the answer yet, but she has 3 more years minimum to figure it out. And for the first time in her life, she's investigating something that actually matters. How to become someone her parents can be proud of, not for what she achieved, but for who she chose to become after everything she built turned to ash.